Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fall series on Figure It Out. We're going to do 13 weeks in the books of 1st and 2nd Peter. There are 8 chapters. We're going to go verse by verse. Tonight's going to be a nice introductory overview on the topic and kind of set us up for the material we'll be looking at. So the title of the series is Heaven, Earth, and Time, some insights from 1st and 2nd Peter. And as we think about heaven, here's an artist that I think does a pretty good job of trying to capture what's in Revelation and in Isaiah and so forth, and the idea of the 4 living creatures and the elders on their thrones around, and there's an emerald rainbow above the throne and so forth, and no one, of course, has any idea what it actually looks like. John got a chance to see it, Isaiah did, Ezekiel did, and as best they could in their own language, they tried to describe what they saw. It must have been incredibly awesome and just left you with a sense of amazement to see it. And then we think of Earth. Earth is really interesting when you think about it. It's a domain that was specifically created by God for mankind. So there's a lot of doctrines out there that talk about the fact that, God is up in heaven longing for us to come be with him in heaven. And so, first of all, God has no needs, okay? He's not lonely. He's not pining for Dave Newton to be up there, okay? He created the earth specifically for us, and it's a beautiful planet, even in its fallen state since the curse. And we can only imagine what it'll be like during the Millennium Kingdom. And then, of course, there'll be a time when there'll be a new earth and a new galaxy, Uranus, the heavens above. And then there's time. And time, a lot of people get mixed up and think that God has lots of time. That's what it means to be in eternity. You have a lot of time. Okay, there's no time in heaven. Time is a physical property of our universe. And we're going to take a look at kind of combining this, thinking about it, and really thinking through God's plan for mankind as commented on in these 8 chapters, 5 in 1st Peter and 3 chapters in 2nd Peter. Peter's going to introduce us throughout his teaching to a really interesting concept. Jesus, who is the third person of the triune God, is eternal and pre-existing in heaven. Many times in the scriptures it says, before the foundation of the world. And yet, he's going to be born of a human woman right within our physical earth into a very temporal world. He'll have a human body. He's going to be an infant and grow up in Nazareth. And he's going to grow up in a temporal world that he himself created. Now, this is the stuff that'll keep you up at night, okay? When you're laying in bed and you think about being outside of time, where time does not impact you at all, think about it from the standpoint of God's perspective. There is no time in the heavenly realm, and yet God is going to step into the temporal realm, and he's actually creator of the temporal realm in which he's going to be born into. And he created this at a very precise, coming into the world, the incarnation is at a very precise moment called the fullness of time. Several of the prophets talk about the fullness of time. And that lands on a linear timeline that has history, it has present, and it has future. That's the only thing you and I can grasp. Our minds, we try to think about what it would be like to be outside of time. And yet, as I look at it, we tend to always fall back on thinking of time as linear, which from the natural world and the physical realm, it really is. We have time past, we have time present, we have time future. Think about this, in about an hour and 5 minutes, this time we're in right now will be history. And we'll be able to say, we look back on the introduction and so forth. So very interesting how that works. A couple of passages to get us thinking about this, kind of set up the table. At the very beginning of the Bible, it starts off with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the physical realm that has time as one of its attributes actually had a starting point. So here's another proof that God is outside of time, because he spoke the creation into being, which was then the beginning of time. Anything prior to that, there was no time. There was no physical universe. John, I think it's also nice, it's chapter 1, verse 1, just like Genesis 1:1. John then says, as he begins his gospel, Jesus was from the beginning. So he's putting Jesus right back at that Genesis 1:1 spot. I don't think that's an accident. All of the guys who were his disciples had good Jewish backgrounds. They would have at least known the basics of the Torah and certainly the beginning of Genesis. And he begins the same way by putting Jesus at Genesis 1:1 in the beginning. And then Jesus' brother Jude writes in his small letter in verse 25, there's only one chapter in Jude, he says, "Our Savior Jesus Christ is before all time." And then he puts two other benchmarks, now and forever. So can you see there he's actually placing Jesus as having been before time. It's not just that he goes back in time to locate when he started. He's saying before time. And then he's also saying now, which speaks to the present, and forever, which is pointing out into the future with no end. So that's what we're looking at, is some basics to get us thinking. Now, a good homework assignment, if anybody in here ever did homework, right? Okay, no one would come to this study if there was homework during the week, right? So, but if there was homework, I would have you go back this week and I'd say, how about all of you find 25 Bible verses that either talk about the past, the present, or the future with respect to God or to Jesus Christ. One that should hopefully pop into your mind at the very beginning is Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. In him there is no shadow of turning, no variance. And so John, later on in his gospel, is quoting, he was there when Jesus was talking with the religious leaders, and Jesus had said to them, "Before Abraham was, I am." And that term, I am, in the Greek is a very famous term in seminaries and in theology books and so forth. It's called the ego eimi. Ego eimi. And ego eimi is the I am. And it's pretty cool because John's going to use ego eimi in his gospel 24 times. It's really a term that he puts into place and utilizes in constantly referring us back to, where did we hear about I am? Well, Moses was being sent to Pharaoh, and he said to the Lord, he says, "Who should I say has sent me then?" He's trying to wiggle his way out of going. Remember how we had that conversation back and forth? And he finally says, "Say that I am who I am has sent you." In the burning bush, that name I am, the ego eimi, it's not in Greek in the Old Testament, but that's that term. And he's basically saying, before even Abraham was, I am. He's saying, I'm the voice from the burning bush. That's who I am. And I put just a few other verses, Isaiah 41, Isaiah 43, Isaiah 48. There are lots of Old Testament passages. You won't find them under ego eimi unless you're in the Greek Septuagint. But you can find I am, if you search an online concordance for the Old Testament, you'll find many statements that say, I am he, etc. In John 17, we get into a slightly different angle, where he's now really defining that he was before the world began. Father, glorify me with the glory I had. This is Jesus speaking, first person, before the world began. So again, he's back there at the beginning of the creation. And I want to make sure we don't lose this point. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's when time started. Everybody okay with that? It's a physical property of the created universe. Its mass accelerating through space is how we end up with time. And we don't have time tonight. Like that one? Okay. We don't have time tonight, but we will go through some basic inferences from Einstein's relativity that really impacts a lot of how we think about the scripture. And so as we think about this, before the world began, Paul writes to the Colossians and he says, by Jesus, all things were created. So now you've got him where again? At the beginning of Genesis 1:1. Everybody okay with what we're doing here? We're pinpointing him. He was there beforehand because by him all things were created. This also is incredible support for the Trinity because we're now not talking about like the old King James tends to make it look like there's three persons sitting on three chairs on a dais or something like that. No, we're talking about the triune God that shows himself in the person of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And again, because we're so finite, we have a hard time grasping that. But Paul says again, Jesus is, by all things were created by him because he was before all things. There he is again, placed before Genesis 1:1. And interestingly, he's the one that holds it all together. Do you remember the article in Time magazine about 35 years ago when they came out with the God particle? And they were trying to say, we think we figured out there's got to be something out there that holds all this together. You know, people got all excited about that. Well, here's John again in his gospel. Another interesting comment about Jesus is that he says of himself, I came down from heaven, meaning I was outside of time. I didn't float down as a grown man. The miracle of the incarnation is that we needed a man, human just like us, to be able to become sin for us for the sole purpose that he could die and take our penalty and be fully aware and understanding of our struggles as human. And so he comes down, born to Mary, grows up in Nazareth, and then begins his ministry at age 30. John chapter 1, the Logos was with God, and I love how he clarifies it. Oh, and by the way, the Logos was God. And you know how the Jehovah's Witnesses change that in their translation, and they basically disregard the Greek. But he was not, the Logos was with God, and the Logos was a God. No, that's not true. He was the God. Okay? And in John 3, Jesus descended from heaven, and then he ascended. So the idea is he comes down into time, which again is hard for us to think about. If you ponder it too much tonight, you might not fall asleep till after midnight because you'll just be looking up at the ceiling trying to put it into how we think of things. In Luke, Luke the physician is recording that Jesus explained on the road to Emmaus as he's walking, he explained Moses and the prophets, so the Torah and Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, etc. So the Torah and the prophets, they all spoke about himself. Wouldn't you love to be on a 7-mile walk with Jesus and have him explain the Torah and the prophets, all the passages that apply to him? John again says, Jesus was talking with the religious leaders, and he says, you know, you guys say that you know the scriptures. And they did, didn't they? In the sense of they had memorized the Torah. If you were a Pharisee, you would have at least memorized Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You know the scriptures, don't you guys? And yet he's kind of making a little dig by saying, if you really did know them, though, you would understand that they what? They testify about me. So he's trying to again say, oh, you're priding yourself how you know the scriptures, but if you really knew them, you'd understand they testify about me. Later on again in John, Jesus says to his disciples, I'm telling you these things about my coming and all before it happens. And he says, why? He says, so when it happens, you will believe I am he. And we're back again to the ego eimi. He's going to essentially say, the reason I'm able to talk about the future is so that when it happens like that, you'll be able to say, wait a minute, that's exactly what Jesus said, and it came about exactly as he said it. Therefore, he can make the claim that he is, I am he. John 14, Peter looks at him and finally just says, okay, everybody's been asking him to do signs and all kinds of things like that. I got an idea. Hey, Jesus, could you just show us the Father? That'll be enough for us. I love Peter, don't you? He just sounds like me all the time. You know, that's the kind of stuff we would ask, right? You know, I don't really want to ask him. You know, I don't really want to look like I don't believe or anything. But how about this? You know, they're all asking for signs and wonders and all. Jesus, would you just show us the Father, and it'd be enough for us? And look at Jesus' response. Peter, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, because I and the Father are one. In fact, we're told in 4 places in the New Testament in Paul's teaching that Jesus Christ is the manifestation for us to be in relationship with of who the Father is. How about in Hebrews? Jesus is the radiance of the Father's glory and the exact representation of his nature. The term nature in the Greek speaks about inherent substance, the inherent substantive content, if you will. And it's a pretty cool word in the Greek. It's hypostasios. Hypostasios. Now, there's no Y in the Greek language. There's a U, and you can put a breath mark in front of it to do a hu, like instead of oo, you can say hu. So there's hypostasios, but in the English translation, it always comes out as hyperstasios. So things like a hypodermic is really, we call it hypodermic and so forth. And so when you see hypostasios, the term there is talking about God's nature at his very core of his substance. And so all the theology books, all the seminaries, all the graduate schools, all the debates among scholars for the last several hundred years and so forth, talk about the hypostatic union. But to be more accurate, it's the hypostatic union. The idea that how could he be what? Both fully divine and also be fully human at the same time. Interesting concept. 1 Timothy chapter 3 says, Paul says to Timothy, says, you know, young buck, young pastor up there in Ephesus, great is the mystery of godliness revealed in the flesh. We talk about the understatement of the world, right? Great is the mystery of Jesus manifesting himself, revealing himself in the flesh. It's God among us. Emmanuel from the Old Testament is God with us. Emmanuel is with us. El is God. Emmanuel, with us, God. This is by far, I think, probably one of the most foundational verses that we'll come back to time and again the next 13 weeks up through December 11th, because it really gets to the heart of, hey, Dr. Dave, I'm having a little trouble getting my head around some of this stuff. Wait till we get to week 4, week 6, week 9. I have a hard time getting my head around it prepping for you, okay? So I don't want you to think that, okay, he's up at the podium, he gets it. No, I still look at this verse and I go, yeah, great is the mystery of godliness revealed in the flesh. This hypostatic union. Jesus became, think about this statement. I've been using this one for quite a long time. Jesus became that which was already made in his image. That'll definitely keep you up. Remember, let us create man in our image. The statement here is Jesus is going to become that which was already made in his image. Wow, he's going to become a man. Let's do a little comparison side by side of the eternal heaven and the created earth. Now, I always want to clarify for you, you're my regular students here, so when you see the Greek term or you hear me talk about the Uranos in the Greek, that's the heavens that we see when we look up. It's the stars, the galaxies, the moon, the planets that we can see and so forth. Just you're out on a hilltop, on a camping trip, on a really crystal clear night, and you look up, you go, oh my gosh, look at all the stars. That's the Uranos. The Jews understood there were 3 heavens. There was the first heaven, which is just kind of our atmosphere around us, what we're breathing and so forth, kind of goes up into the clouds. Then there was this thing at nighttime, which was this expanse way up above us, the second heaven. And then the third heaven is the Lord's domain. So when you hear about a new heaven and a new earth, okay, the Lord is not making a new heaven for himself. Okay, his heaven is eternal, outside of time. He's talking about when there is a new earth, there's also going to be a new Uranos up above it. If you think this is beautiful on a starry night with your telescope or without, just looking up at the Milky Way or something like that, can you imagine what the new earth and the new heaven are going to be like? I mean, it's going to be amazing. But let's put them side by side for a moment. The eternal heaven, God's domain, has no beginning. But us here on earth, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. Huge difference. The eternal heaven is extratemporal. It's outside of time and space. However, we are in time. In fact, time is a physical function of the creation, mass accelerating through space. Number 3, heaven, as we know, that's God's majestic realm. And as I said, you can search the web for all kinds of artists who have tried to read through Isaiah 6 and Revelation 4 and Revelation 7 and Ezekiel 1, and they try to say, okay, I think I've got it. And they start painting, and pretty soon they run out of canvas space, and they're throwing things on top of each other, and they always end up with something where you look at it and you go, good try, but I don't think that that picture that you came up with of heaven even gets close to what John would have seen or what Ezekiel saw or what Isaiah took a look at. God's majestic realm is his majesty, his throne room. The earth that we live on was created specifically for mankind. It's got gravity, and your body walks around. Even before the fall, you walked around on the planet, and there's trees that grow with different fruit and so forth, and there were animals, and there's water. And so pretty close to what we have today, although it's in a fallen state, but so different than God's majestic realm of his majesty in heaven. Number 4, there is no end to God's heaven. So whenever you hear from Revelation, John say, and I saw the new heaven and the new earth, that term new heaven is the oranos. I saw some kind of a new stars and heavenly bodies up above a new earth. And it was just, he's blown away by it. But he's not talking about God was going, yeah, I've been here a while. I think it's time for an upgrade to the heaven. We'll do something different, okay? The universe, unlike heaven, we're told, and we're going to see this as we go through this study, is going to ultimately be rolled up like a scroll. That's the language used. Our entire universe is going to end. In fact, modern physics, we'll get in a couple weeks, is going to show us that the universe is winding down through all kinds of measurements that they've made. It's going to be rolled up like a scroll. We're told that the elements in our universe are going to melt with intense heat. That's what happens, these two things, right before what? Then I saw a new heaven and a new Uranus above it. The new earth with the new Uranus above can only come about if the old universe is rolled up like a scroll and all the elements melt with intense heat. So, as a quick little reminder for you, if you were here for the Revelation study, the Daniel study, even some of the stuff we covered in apologetics, always remember that during the millennium, we will be on this planet, but it'll be in a revived, a restored fashion, back to before the curse. During eternity, after the Great White Throne Judgment, this earth, this Uranus, our moon, our sun, they're going to be rolled up like a scroll. The elements will melt with intense heat. We are going to be on a brand new earth with a brand new Uranus over us. So I always say this, if you think Earth is beautiful now, you ever watch some of those PBS specials just called Planet Earth? And it's just this incredible photography of snow-covered mountains and lava and waterfalls and whales out in the ocean and wildlife running across the Serengeti and all kinds of plant life and bird life and just everything. I mean, the planet is amazing. I go back to what Paul says, eye has not seen, and ear hasn't even begun to hear the things that God has prepared for those who love him. So if we think this is good, it's going to be way beyond anything we could imagine. The eternal God from the extratemporal realm is going to enter into the physical limitations of earth. That's called the hypostatic union. Hypostasius. Okay, he's going to actually have a melding of the divine nature fully manifested in a man. And that's why Paul can say, at the fullness of time is when Jesus came into the world. Now that's the key term for us. I'm going to make the case tonight that for our study in 1 Peter, I would love you at the middle of December, we finish up on December 11th, I'd love that after we have these 13 studies, you'd be at a place where you would feel very confident saying there are arguably, two of the most important dates in the Bible that you'll ever check on. One is going to be the birth of Jesus, which is the incarnation when he comes into the world. And the second is going to be when he gives his life on Calvary, on the cross, during Passover. And those two dates are what the entire Old Testament, prophets, everything is about those two dates. Everything written in the Torah and the prophets is pointing to God coming in the flesh, Messiah being revealed, and then ultimately he comes for one purpose. You can always remember 1 Corinthians, you ladies who are in the 1 Corinthians, or I guess you're doing 2 Corinthians now this fall. When you finished up 1 Corinthians, you should remember from chapter 15, verses 3 and 4. Paul reminds everybody the definition of the gospel. Jesus died and was buried. How? According to the scriptures. Pointing to what? The Torah and the Psalms and the prophets. And number two, he was raised again on the third day according to the scriptures. So everything on our human timeline, I would make the case that the two most important dates that you want to be comfortable with coming out of this study are when did the incarnation take place? When did he come? The hypostatic union. When did God become a man for the purpose of saving mankind? And number two, when did he die on the cross for our sins? So, eternal in the heaven. God then comes from eternal in the heaven. We've already established he was there before time. He was there before in the beginning. He's going to step into the fullness of time, as Galatians 4:4 says. It's going to be remarkable precision. It's not going to just be, any date. It's going to be the culmination of all prophecy. It's going to culminate in his coming. And finally, number three, it's going to confirm that the scriptures are true, because how could they have all this stuff written 400, 700, 1,000, 1,200, 2,000 years before it happened and have it be so incredibly accurate in its fulfillment in Jesus Christ? Does that make sense? Okay? So that's the real heart of this study, is to give you these things, the remarkable precision, it's the culmination of all prophecy, and it's the confirmation that the scriptures are true. And so we'll put a little arrow here. Look where it's pointing to. Nazareth, Bethlehem, Judea, right? I mean, think about it. Our planet floating through the cosmos. There's this one little area right on the eastern portion of this water, this saltwater body. And that's where it's all going to happen. So the question then becomes, okay, when exactly did that happen? And as we think about when exactly, you might have seen me bring this up before, and we're going to have a little fun with this. The 1984 movie Back to the Future. Christopher, what's that? Lloyd. Oh yeah, Christopher Lloyd, he's a former Santa Barbara resident. He actually makes this statement to Michael J. Fox's character, Marty McFly. He says, "Hey Marty, let's say you want to go back in time and witness the birth of Christ." And he goes into the DeLorean time machine and he sets it for what? December 25th, year zero. And everybody in the theater does what? Well, you just did. You have a good laugh, right? It's fun. The sad thing is, there have been surveys done by the Pew Foundation, by Christianity Today, and by other religious kinds of data collection groups over the last several decades who have actually asked Christians in churches, when was Jesus born? Always more than 80% say December 25th in the year zero. So the thing we laugh at in Back to the Future is actually how most people just say, isn't that it? Right? And so we're going to take a little time to just set the table on this one. Some of you have maybe seen this in more detail in prior years. We haven't actually looked at it in a couple of years because of COVID and so forth, but there is only one window of time In all timeline of human history, there's only one timeline, one space, one 3-year window where Jesus could come into the world. Because remember what I said, is it's going to be incredible precision, it's going to confirm the scriptures, and it's going to fulfill prophecy. Jesus didn't just show up willy-nilly on a date that, he's up in heaven and just said, yeah, I think I'll go get born right now. Or, we don't want to treat it that way. No, this was God's plan from the very beginning. And these 3 folks are literally the whole basis for how we understand the birth of Christ. The emperor of Rome, Caesar Augustus, the very first Caesar, the first emperor. A guy by the name of Publius Sulpicius Quirinius. Don't you love those Latin Roman names, right? There was a guy after him in about 24 years, actually 17 years after him, who also got the post of being the governor of the Syrian province, and his name was Pontius Pilate. But before Pontius Pilate, there was a guy in charge of the Syrian province, which is Judea, remember, had lost all its sovereignty. It was no longer a nation. It was a little area inside a section called the Syrian province, which was there on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean as part of the Roman Empire. And the Romans put in place a governor for all their provinces. Pamphylia, Cappadocia, Bithynia, these were all other provinces that had a governor. And the governor of Syrian province at the time of Jesus' birth was, we're told, a guy by the name of Quirinius. And his full name is, from history books, is Publius Sulpicius Quirinius. And of course, the third person is Herod the Great. These 3 are part of all of the statements about the birth of Christ. So it's logical that we should say what? Let's go on to the timeline and find out when the overlap was for those 3. Does that make sense? Okay, good. All right, we had one person said it makes sense. Everybody else is like, I have no idea what you're doing, Dave, but just keep talking. Okay. This is also outlined in much, much more detail in a book I did 5 years ago called The Birth of Jesus on Yom Teruah. And we still have some copies that were paid for by some really generous donors. So I bought 3 boxes with me tonight, and you'll be able to take one home for free if you'd like at the end of the service. And you can even give one to a friend if you'd like. I'd rather not take them back home. Did you know that this past Friday at sunset was Tishri 1? It was Yom Teruah. It was the beginning of the Feast of Blowing Trumpets. Now, it's been expanded since the time of the Babylonian Talmud. It's been expanded to 2 days. So it goes Friday sunset to Sunday sunset. And Yom Teruah is Rosh Hashanah. It's New Year's Day. If you go into the Old Testament, you'll actually see, we won't have time tonight, but you'll actually see that the original first month, Nisan, and Tishri, which was originally the 7th month in the civil calendar, got swapped out for the religious calendar to where Tishri is now the first month, and Nisan's out in the spring there. And the feasts are all built around these months and so forth for Israel. And so New Year's Day happens on, the 1st of Tishri. And again, we're looking for some remarkable precision. We're looking for some culmination of prophecy, and we're looking for some confirmation that the scriptures are true. So point number 1, who are the 3 guys? Do you remember we have to have Caesar Augustus, Quirinius, and Herod the Great. Got to have some overlap. Can you imagine if there was a time in history when none of the 3 of them were in office at the same time? What would that do to the scriptures? It would completely undermine them as not being true, because all 3 are in the narrative. Make sense? Okay. So here he is. He was born Gaius Octavius on September 23rd in 63 BC. He was crowned at age 36 in 27 BC. He's Rome's very first emperor. His term in the Latin is Divi Filius Augustus, the divine son of August. Always remember, we also get caught up in believing that January has always been the first month of the year, right? We think it's been like that for forever. January has only been the first month of the year since about 1750. Okay, the first month of the year was always March. Okay, the new year always started in March, and it ended at the end of February. And so again, we'll talk some more about this as we go through the study in the coming weeks. He died August 19th of 14 AD. So you see the two dates I put in yellow for you, 27 BC to 14 AD. That's the only time that we have a Caesar Augustus, okay? And the reason we want to know about him is because Luke says that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed or go through this particular polling, this census. Number 2, our buddy Publius Sulpicius Quirinius. He was born in 53 BC, he lived to 21 AD. He was born in Lanuvium, which is just outside of Rome. And he had a title put on him. He was a former general who had a lot of victories in battle. And typically when you're, back in those days anyway, you'd have all your victories when you're in your 20s and your early 30s. And life expectancy was around 40 or so, 42, 44. So they give you a governorship as kind of a way to say, hey, thanks for your service. You know, now you can run a little province inside the Roman Empire. And so he's the legate governor of the Syrian province from 4 BC to 12 AD. So he's in there before Pontius Pilate by about 15 years or so. And the reason we need him is because this took place, the first census took place. The first time we did one was when Quirinius was governor of Syria. So now we have Caesar Augustus, we have Quirinius. And number 3, Herod the Great. And Herod, he's the son of Herod Antipater. He's an Edomite, which means he's not a Jew. He's from Edom. Okay, he's not a Jew. He's an Idumean, and the Hasmoneans ruled Judea from 140 until 63 BC, and then they were conquered by Pompey in 63. And this Idumean general by the name of Herod, defeated Antigonus in 37 BC, and they were all really excited for him and stuff. And he went ahead and paid money to the Roman Senate to have them declare him King of the Jews. This is a title you could buy. Okay? Think about that. So the Roman Senate took about 8 months, and then they ultimately granted him his title. And we're told by Flavius Josephus that he died, quote unquote, after a lunar eclipse in Judea, but prior to Passover. And if you go to any National Geographic website, history.com, just go down, Britannica.com, go to Wikipedia, every one of them, virtually everyone, will say that, it's the eclipse of 4 BC. And so they all have him dead before 4 BC. That, if you go with that, of course, that does not provide for the basis of what we're going to look at this evening. But if you would just take a simple look at NASA and at some of the other astronomical tables, not astrological tables, okay, astronomical tables, that have all the recurrences of where eclipses take place and where they're viewed from, there was a massive eclipse that could be seen from Judea in January of 1 BC. That is the one, we'll see in a moment, that I believe Flavius Josephus is pointing to. He's saying he died between the eclipse of 1 BC in January and Passover that spring, which would have happened in April. So sometime between January and April and 1 BC is when he died. And the reason we need him is because we're told in Matthew and Luke's gospel, in the days of Herod, king of Judea, and it goes on like that. So here's the 3 of them. Caesar Augustus in blue, Quirinius in kind of the tan there, and Herod the Great in kind of the pink color there, the orange peach color. So here is Caesar Augustus, 27 BC to 14 AD. Here is Quirinius, 4 BC to 12 AD. See what I'm doing? Kind of narrowing in. And then here's when Herod the Great was king. There you have it. So between 4 BC and 1 BC is the only overlap between the 3 of them. So if the scriptures are true, that's the only time period in which Jesus Christ could have come in the hypostatic union, could have come and stepped into the timeline of our temporal world and been born as a baby to Mary. Point number 4. We'll just cover this briefly. It's in the book in detail. You can read on your own. But Did you ever wonder, I always love to read this, why was there such a lengthy discussion about Zacharias serving in the temple and his wife is Elizabeth? Well, so many people think of that, they had to put that in there because they're the parents of John the Baptist. And of course, that's a good reason. But why is it that we have to be told that Zacharias is of the course of Abijah? When you read that, most people read it and just go, course of Abijah, I have no idea what that is, just let's keep moving on. Well, if you go back to 1 Chronicles chapter 24, there's this lengthy explanation the Lord gives to his people about who's going to serve in the temple. And there's going to be 24 cycles, which means for 12 months, a group goes through, and then for the next 12 months, a group goes through, and then you go back again, and the other group starts up. And here's the courses: Jehoiarib, Jediah, Haram, Seroyim, etc. You can see all of them. And course number 8 is the 8th course of Abijah. And you think to yourself, well, why is that important to know? Well, in the gospel accounts, it says Zacharias was serving in the temple, for he was of the 8th course of Abijah. And you think to yourself, did we need to know that? Well, actually, you do. Think about it. We're told by Flavius Josephus and by Eusebius and Tertullian that at the time the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in 70 AD, they had just begun the beginning of the courses once again. They were coming up right to the beginning of the first course of the 24. Jehoiarib was going to get started. So if you were thinking, okay, I've got to find a time between 4 BC and 1 BC, and Zacharias has to be where? In the temple to see an angel who's going to tell him his wife is going to have a son and to name him John, and that he's going to be the second cousin of Jesus because Mary and Elizabeth are cousins. And we're told that they saw each other, Mary and Elizabeth saw each other when Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant. And when she came and saw her cousin, the baby did what? Leaped inside her womb. And we're even told in the scriptures that John the Baptist was filled with the Holy Spirit in the womb. All kinds of things we could run with that. We're not going to, okay? But think about that. The closest time then for Abijah, which you can actually count them out, and some really gifted, nerdy numbers folks, not me, have gone through and said, okay, if the course of Abijah is the 8th course, we could count backwards from the time the temple was destroyed, which is at the beginning of that was right at the time that Jehoiarib was going to begin its. So you could go back then and go to the 24th course, the 23rd, 22nd, 21st, 20, 19, 18. Just keep counting monthly courses and just keep going back from 70 AD and try to get something in between where? 1 BC and 4 BC. That would be a time when Zacharias would be inside the temple serving at the course of Abijah. Everybody know what we're doing? Okay. Well, the closest one that comes out is July 13th of 3 BC. That fits in our 1 BC to 4 BC, right? Okay. Well, Mary and Elizabeth. Zacharias, if he was in the temple in July of 3 BC and he sees an angel and the angel says your wife's going to have a son, you're going to name him John, and he kind of laughs at that, and what happens to him? He's not allowed to speak until the baby's born, and when they're getting ready to circumcise him after John's born on the 8th day, they're ready to call him, let's call him after his dad, Zacharias. And just as they get ready to do so, the dad's lips are loosened. He's allowed to say, you will call him John. He's going to be in line with what the angel told him. So they're going to have a son named John. We know from Luke's gospel, Elizabeth was in her 6th month. So 6 months from July would be sometime in January of 2 BC. That's when Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting when she comes in and sees him, and the baby leaped inside her womb. We're now in January of 2 BC. And so we think to ourselves, wow, that's pretty exciting. John the Baptist is then going to be born, if you count out about 40 weeks. Maybe he came a little early. You know, one of my grandchildren came a month early. Okay. Sometimes they come a few days late. Well, John the Baptist would have been born somewhere around April of 2 BC. That's about 40 weeks out from July of 3 BC. Jesus is how much younger than his cousin? 6 months, right? Because John's 6 months in the womb when Mary comes to see her and tells what she just got told. Elizabeth's already pregnant 6 months with John. So if John the Baptist is born in April, Jesus would be born in September, 6 months later. And it just so happens that in 2 BC, Yom Teruah, the Feast of Blowing Trumpets, the brand new year, the first of Tishri, took place on September 29th of 2 BC. Think about that. We need something between 1 BC and 4 BC. And September 29th of 2 BC allows for, we got Herod, Caesar Augustus, Quirinius, and we've also got Zacharias serving in the temple, being told he's going to have a son, and the son is born 6 months before John, and it fits with the 8th course of Abijah happening in July of 3 BC. As they used to, in New Jersey, we would say, I'm just saying. You know, I mean, it's one of those ones where you're afraid to say how true this is, but the reality is this is really amazing. Point number 6, remember our study in Daniel? Daniel chapter 9 had some interesting timing. There were 70 Shabuah appointed for Israel, and we learned that 69 of those, 7 plus 62, these weeks of years, 7-year periods called a Shabuah, from the time to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, there will be 69 weeks of years until Mashiach Nagid, Messiah the King. In Nehemiah chapter 2, we learned that Artaxerxes Longimanus is in his 20th year of his reign. History tells us very clearly from all kinds of sources he ruled from 465 to 445 BC, so his 20th year was 445 BC. And it just so happens the beginning of Nisan was on the 14th of March in 445 BC. So we find out that when you count out the 7 Shabuah, or 49 years from that date, you come to 397 BC. That's the close of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi. Wow. That means there's not another prophet until John the Baptist is preaching before Jesus comes. If you take the full 69 Shabuah, a guy by the name of Sir Robert Anderson, a former lead detective from Scotland Yard, partnered for 3.5 years with the chief astronomer royal at the Greenwich Observatory outside London, and they did all the calculations, leap years, and adjusted for everything, and they figured out that 173,880 days, which is exactly 483 years at 360 days per year, comes out to April 6th of 32 AD. That's the day that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. We call it Palm Sunday. Exactly as Daniel had prophesied, how long before? About 500 years beforehand, 550 or so. Exact date. By the way, April 6th of 32 AD also happened to be the 10th of Nisan, which is the beginning of Passover week. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, this is amazing precision. Mashiach is going to ultimately be cut off, we're told in Daniel's prophecy, but not for himself. How is Jesus cut off? He goes to the cross, but not for himself. For what? For you and I. Isn't that amazing? You can read about that. It's completely free. Just go on your website, whatever your favorite search engine is, look up The Coming Prince by Sir Robert Anderson. The PDF is available there on the web for free, and you can actually read through. It was published in 1894 in the Victorian era. It's a fascinating read, but it gives us that kind of precision again. Point number 7. When you read the Christmas story, you always hear what? All the shepherds are hunkered down inside Nazareth because it's freezing cold outside, and they have all the animals inside the barn and everything. No. What did you hear? They're out in the fields watching over their flocks by night. Well, you don't do that on December 25th in Israel, okay? But if it was the late September, it'd be what? Look at what the holidayweather.com, AccuWeather, and weatherspark.com all have to say about weather in and around Bethlehem. Average temperature 72, 80, 76 degrees. They're out with their flocks. Don't have to bring them in each night because it's warm, it's balmy, and they're hanging out. And Luke tells us the Bethlehem sheep herders were outside with their flocks on a very nice fall evening. Because December in Bethlehem can actually be pretty interesting. The high temp is only around 55 on average. It gets down to about 30 at night. And there are lots of instances of some snow flurries and little dustings of snow. In fact, in 1992, Bethlehem got 20 inches of snow in December, okay? Not that they get it every year, but it'd be cold. Point number 8, the Magi. Many of you think of them as we three kings of Orient are. We've all sung that classic hymn, and we've seen over the decades and the millennia how they've been built up to become, these three guys on camels and so forth. But to really understand them, in Daniel chapter 4 and chapter 5, Daniel is made a title called Rab Maj. He's the chief of the Magi. The Magi were the ones who were completely over all of Persia's coronations. They actually had a council of magistanes. That old word has become our word for a magistrate. It comes from that word magi. And the magistanes were the ones who selected kings. Daniel's 69 Shabuah, the 7 plus 62 is 69, and the Magi, that's in their resource reference library back in Babylon. I think if you went up to the card catalog, you could go to D for Daniel, and you kind of slide the box out, and you could look up some of Daniel's writings. They went through and checked them out, the charts, the graphs, the stars, the maps, and so forth, and figured out about Daniel's Mashiach Nagid, coming from a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Matthew chapter 2, after Jesus was born, Magi from the east arrived. A massive caravan. When you're coming from Babylon, you're coming from Persia, Parthia, all the way into Jerusalem, you don't ride three guys on a camel across the desert. Okay, this is probably anywhere from 150 to 300 in their entourage with all kinds of animals for feeding, for food and so forth, the tents that they would bring, a Parthian, Persian cavalry escort with their big lances and their spears and all their flags waving and the turbans and so forth. And Herod was very worried because you know where they were asking? Where is him who's born king of the Jews? And we know that Herod was not born king of the Jews. He paid for it through the Senate. And he was very much a major insult to him because he's an Idumean. He was not born king of the Jews. What was the right age to begin ministry? Well, we're told in Numbers chapter 4, verse 30, that 30 years of age is the acceptable age to begin ministry. In fact, Luke makes it clear in his own gospel when Jesus began his ministry, he was 30 years of age. Right? That takes care of that. That means if he was born in 2 BC, he would have started his ministry in 29 AD. Back to the Persian Parthian Magi. Herod asked the scribes, where is Mashiach going to be born? Remember, he's not a Jew. He doesn't even know his own scriptures, right? And his guys come back to him, they roll out the scroll of Micah, and they say, oh, Bethlehem Ephrathah, that's where he's going to be born. That's what Micah says. The Magi bring prophetic gifts, and we see two interesting Greek words when we read the gospel accounts. They come to a house, and they see a paidion. And a paidion in the Greek is a small toddler, maybe between 4 and 8 months old, maybe standing, maybe crawling. Whereas a brephos, you'd see a brephos in the manger. A brephos in the Greek is a newborn infant. The shepherds come and they see a brephos in the manger. The Magi come to a house and they see a paidion, a 4 to 6, 7-month-old toddler, pre-toddler, someone crawling. And what are the gifts that they bring? Gold, which signifies his kingship. Frankincense, that he's a priest. That's the incense in the temple. And myrrh, what an interesting gift to bring to a baby. Myrrh is an embalming spice for getting somebody ready for burial. Isaiah chapter 60 says this, when Jesus comes at his second coming, he's coming with gold, and he's coming with frankincense, and no myrrh. And I always think to myself, why no myrrh? Well, tetelestai. It is finished. It had already been taken care of at the cross. I get chills when I think about that he's coming with gold and with frankincense at his triumphant second coming. And yet the gifts given to him at his first coming included myrrh, prophetic for the fact that he was going to die. Point number 10. This is just me getting super nerdy in my book. I just have a little synopsis here of this, but I love statistics, I love forecasting analysis and so forth. Archaeologists say that the population in the first century of Bethlehem was around 1,000 people. Today there's about 30,000 people in Bethlehem. Micah says 700 years BC, And he gives his prophecy about Bethlehem being the birthplace of the Messiah. And the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. That's the last year you would have known what tribe you were from, because the records were stored in the temple and they were destroyed when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. So you have a 770-year window from 700 BC to 70 AD. In that window, that's when Messiah has to be born in Bethlehem to know that he's from the tribe of Judah. If you take some population models, average about 7 births per year that would have survived, given all the infant mortality and so forth, up to an adult age, during those 770 years, we're going to approximate about 5,400 live births survive to adulthood in that window, from the time of Micah's forecasted prophecy up until the time the temple was destroyed. In that window, be about 5,400 kids born in Bethlehem who made it to adult. Assuming 50-50 on male to female, you'd have about 2,700 males, half the 5,400. Does that make sense? Okay. And if there's 12 tribes, let's just assume that they were kind of equally distributed across the 12 tribes. That means about 1/12 of those 2,700 males, or about 225 of them, were from the tribe of Judah. You see what we're getting at here? How many people could claim to be Messiah in the whole history of the world? Well, only 225 in all of history were probably born in that window of the tribe of Judah and survived to adulthood. PopulationReferenceBureau.com says there's about 108 billion people have been born on planet Earth going all the way back. That's how many have been on the planet total. In that 770 years, about 4.32 million people would have been alive or born during that time. So that means in that window, 225 Bethlehem males who were from the tribe of Judah represents 0.00005. That's 5/1000th of 1%. So the likelihood that you are the male from the tribe of Judah, born in Bethlehem between 4 BC and 1 BC, is minuscule. It's not like, oh, there's all kinds of guys who could have been Messiah. I mean, I'm saying there's a tiny, tiny, tiny amount. And finally, points 11, 12, and 13. The extra-biblical accounts, Augustus says this. Tertullian, writes that Augustus was born 41 years before Jesus. That would be 41 years before. So he started in 43 BC, so 2 BC. He died 15 years after. So from 14 AD, come back 15 years, that's 2 BC. Jesus was born 28 years after Cleopatra had her death with Mark Antony. That was in 30 BC, so 28 years would be 2 BC. Are you seeing a pattern here? Okay. Irenaeus writes, Jesus was born in the 41st year of Augustus. He ruled from fall of 3 BC to the fall of 2 BC. Eusebius says he was born in Augustus's 42nd year, which was from the fall of 2 BC to the fall of 1 BC. See the common overlap there again, 2 BC in the fall. Jesus was born 28 years after the death of Cleopatra in 30. So again, we're looking at 2 BC, having lots of additional historical documentation to support it. So in summary, everything has to fit. You can't read through the scriptures and say, well, a couple things fit, other things are kind of problematic. We'll just leave them as problematic. I've had pastors for decades come to these passages and say things like, what about the course of Abijah for Zacharias? Oh, we don't know about that. That's a little sticky point there. We're just going to leave that one. And so I'm hoping that as you see this process of heaven, earth, and time, everything has to fit. So John the Baptist was born in April 29th, perhaps, of 2 BC. His ministry would start in the spring of 29 AD. Jesus was born on Tishri, the new year, Rosh Hashanah, September 29th of 2 BC. His ministry would start in September of 29 AD, 6 months after John, because John's 6 months older than him, at a time when Augustus and Quirinius and Herod are ruling. The Magi would arrive sometime the following spring of 1 BC. Herod orders all the children to be killed 2 years old and under in Bethlehem in the spring of 1 BC. But then he dies after the eclipse of January 1 BC and before Passover. Jesus, we're told in John's Gospel, I love this, he went to 3 Passovers. John chapter 2, John chapter 6, and John chapter 12 said there were three. The last Passover was the one that he was crucified on the cross. Daniel's exact day of April 6th of 32 AD, Jesus is 31 and a half years old. He's been in ministry from the fall of 29 AD. Now it's the spring of 32 AD when he rides into Jerusalem, about almost 3 years. Everything absolutely fits with the fullness of time, this exact time period. So, we'll close with this. Heaven, earth, and time. The precision we're going to look at is unbelievable on the things that Peter's going to introduce to us about these concepts. And at least for now, this past weekend was Christmas weekend. Now, I know we're all getting excited for December 25th, and we'll have a candlelight Christmas Eve service on the 24th. And everybody has been asking me for 35 years, Dave, are you just like a wet blanket that's thrown on top of Christmas? And I always say no. I love a Christmas tree like anybody else. I like the lights. I like seeing grandkids, getting excited about presents and so forth. But the reality is, if we're really going to say we believe our Bibles, okay, rather than Christopher Lloyd, okay, Doc Brown, okay, and Back to the Future, Jesus was not born on December 25th in the year 0000, okay? In fact, the 25th was brought about because it was when the Romans celebrated the Saturnalia, the winter solstice, the death of Tammuz, and then he's reborn again. There's a Chaldean term for a log that they burn, symbolizing his death. It's called the Yule. You ever have a Yule log? Where did that come from? And then, of course, when he's reborn as a tall evergreen tree adorned with all kinds of jewels and candles and so forth, okay? This is where this stuff comes from. It's all pagan. Now, I'm not here to put a big damper on your decorating your home or, not getting new lights for your tree or your house or anything like that. I decorate my house. We have a Christmas tree. My kids loved getting presents on Christmas morning. I love spoiling my grandkids with Christmas stuff. But as a side note, let's remember our scriptures. In so many areas, we want to do what? We want to hold on to the truth of the scriptures, and yet in this one area, we tend to be like, December 25th, year 0, I'm good with that. Okay. We're going to see time, heaven, earth, and time. Heaven and earth are going to intersect at a very specific time, this hypostatic union of Jesus stepping into our timeline, becoming a man, and Peter is going to come on it. It's going to be incredible. There it is. That's where he stepped into. If you were out orbiting the globe, what an interesting thing to think, that little area right at the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, that's where God's going to step into time, not at a random time, but at a very specific time that does what? It confirms the scriptures, it fulfills all of prophecy, and it demonstrates the precision that God does in everything he does. Jesus literally was born of a woman in 2 BC. He's also eternal, pre-existent outside of earth and time. He's fully creator God, one and the same with the Father and the Holy Spirit, present at creation in the beginning. And yet he's able to do what? If you go to the Old Testament, we've talked about these many times in our studies, about a theophany, which is where Jesus shows himself in the Old Testament in bodily form. A couple of them are Abraham entertains 3 guests who come into the oaks of Mamre, one of which is the Lord. Jacob wrestles with the pre-incarnate Christ. Joshua speaks and falls down and worships the captain of the Lord's army. Manoah and his wife are visited by this one who they then sacrifice a meat offering as a sacrifice of sin, and it's accepted by him. How about in the Babylonian kiln with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? There's a 4th one that looks like the Son of Man. And there are several of these theophanies in the Old Testament. And it's just amazing to think that he's born at a very specific time, in time, and yet he's outside of time so that he can actually be present at the very beginning and speak the creation into being. For next Monday, read 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, first 9 verses. And we're going to take a look at these concepts that Peter's going to introduce. Foreknowledge. How does that work? What is our living hope? And what is our imperishable inheritance? Did everybody in here know that you right now have a document, has your name on it? It's your inheritance. Okay? It's not at the courthouse. It's nothing you're going to fight over with your just an in-laws or something. But you have an inheritance that's imperishable. It's the proof of your faith. Wow. And there's a salvation that's going to ultimately be revealed in the end times when Jesus himself in the end times will also be revealed. That's in the first 9 verses of 1 Peter chapter 1. Let me pray, and then we'll do some questions. Father, thank you for this time to set the table for the precision of your timeline. And Lord, I thank you for Peter's letters, Lord, as we get to dive into these 8 chapters and take a look at heaven, take a look at earth, and take a look at this concept of time. And Lord, I pray that you'd give us wisdom and understanding, guide our time in the Word. I pray we'd enjoy reading through these 2 letters, these 8 chapters. And Father, I thank you for the opportunity to get together on Monday nights. I pray a blessing on each person who's here. And Lord, we look forward, Lord, just to the blessing of opening our eyes to a deeper understanding of your Word because of the time we spend together. So we pray it in your name.